Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. Well, this is the introductory video to monetary policy, which is the other tool that governments have in order to work on the economy. What do I mean by that? Well, there's fiscal policy, which is the government's tool to manage both taxation and government spending. And monetary policy is the government's tool through the manipulation of the money supply and interest rates. Money supply and interest rates. And I like to say and like to think of it as like monetary policy as being a hammer that's in a toolbox that the government goes to and it grabs its monetary policy hammer. And one side of the hammer is the money supply, and the other side of the hammer is the interest rates. Both sides of the hammer have a particular function, right? To manipulate the money supply, we'll talk about what that means, and to manipulate interest rates. But it's still just one tool that has two sides to it, okay? And of course, the whole point of manipulating the money supply and interest rates is aimed at stimulating or contracting aggregate demand to promote the achievement of macroeconomic goals of full unemployment, economic growth, price level stability, which is inflation. And so, therefore, the government has these two tools in its toolbox: fiscal policy, monetary policy. Let's check out more in depthly on monetary policy. All right, so check it out. Monetary policy, government use of interest rates and the money supply. Key idea: government use of interest rates and the money supply to do what? To impact aggregate demand. So the goal here is the government's looking at aggregate demand and is going to figure out how to manipulate it, how to use this tool of monetary policy to manipulate aggregate demand. So a formal definition would be a central bank. What? Who's a central bank? What do you mean a bank? Central bank. Yeah. The government's bank. All countries have some form of a central bank. In the United States, they call it the Federal Reserve Bank. In the UK, it's called the Bank of England. In China, it's the People's Bank of China. But it's just a bank that the government has a control over and uses it to manipulate the money supply and interest rates in an economy aimed at stimulating or contracting aggregate demand to promote the achievement of the macroeconomic goals, which I already said to you. So this is one of the main tools of policymakers to achieve major macroeconomic goals. The other tool, of course, fiscal policy. The hammer of fiscal policy, taxing and spending. The hammer of monetary policy, interest rates and money supply. So which brings up the issue like, hello? What is the central bank? What's a central bank and what is its role? What's its role in the economy? And it's the central bank, which is the organization or the organism of the government that's going to manipulate the monetary policy. Okay, so a central bank definition is a central bank is the institution in most modern market economies that controls the overall supply of money in the nation's economy. Most central banks are independent. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that most governments have a bank that controls the supply of money. Now, hold off on just thinking like one of the quick things that a lot of IB students do, or any economic students, is they jump to this conclusion that they're going to start like printing money, and printing money is the supply of money. No, well, that's one way, but that's actually the easiest and simplest way, but it's not the most common. So we're going to talk about ways in which the government can control the amount of cash that is flowing around in an economy. And one of the really simple, straightforward things I think that you can have in your head, if you know enough about economics, is central banks or governments sell bonds. And these bonds are basically cash that you can't spend anywhere else but with the government. Think about it that way. That's a ridiculous definition, really, for a bond. But governments issue a bond. So you pay $100 for a U.S. Treasury bond. That bond is worth $100. Can you go to the grocery store and sell and use your bond to buy groceries? No. Can you use it to buy a car? No. You just have a piece of paper, a bond, that's worth 100 US dollars. What happened to your $100 that you used to have? Oh, you gave it to the central bank. Oh, so guess where that money now is? Oh, guess what? It is in the central bank. And guess what? It's technically out of the flow of money. U.S. government sold you a bond and traded you something you cannot use anywhere else, and they took your $100 and they're holding on to it. There is 100 fewer dollars circulating around in the U.S. economy now. And so that's one of the real simple ways in which the government, it's not really that simple, but controls the supply of money. So I just wanted to plant that in your head. So what does a central bank do? Well, it issues currency. We know that. It sets and it can inject new money into the system, right? It can actually issue new Federal Reserve notes or dollars, and then give them to the banks. And the banks, the commercial banks, then use those in order to create loans or whatnot. Okay. One thing I want to say: a central bank is not a public bank. It's not like you could walk up in the UK or in China or the United States and open up a bank account at the central bank. No, the central bank is the bank of the banks. Think of it that way. If you think about the United States has many different banks, and all of the banks are affiliated with the central bank, which is the U.S. government bank, and the U.S. government bank, which is, by the way, it's called the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, controls the money supply. So when the Fed, the Federal Reserve, issues money, new money into the system, they don't just go out on the street and start selling it. No, they make it available to banks, and then banks take that money and loan it out to us in the public. Okay. Another thing that the central bank can do is set reserve requirements. Setting a reserve requirement. This is, here's the formal definition, the fraction of the checking account balances that commercial banks must keep in their vaults. The larger the reserve requirement, the less money commercial banks can loan out. So a good example would be like the United States federal government could set a 20% reserve requirement, which means that commercial banks like Bank of America have to keep 20% on reserve so that at any given time. Well, that might not seem like that big a deal, but they have 20% of all of their income, which is all of the deposits in their bank, have to be available at any one time, which means they can't loan that money, which means that money is effectively out of the flow of cash, right? That money's just sitting in a bank. It's not really being used. It's leaked out. It's sitting in a bank. If the government, then the U.S. federal bank or the Fed, were to change that reserve requirement to 10%, whoa, then those banks, what would they do with that extra, with the difference between 20% and 10%? Well, they would inject it into society. And all of a sudden there would be this increase in the money supply through a change in the setting of reserve requirements. You get it? So it's not printing money. It's just saying, okay, if they want to constrict the money supply, change it from 20% to 30%. They just cut the money supply by 10% because banks have to keep that out of the circulation. It's a leakage. What if they cut it? What if they cut it though? The money, the setting, the reserve requirement, they cut it from 20 to 10. Oh man, there's just another injection of cash into the system, and it's actually the same amount of dollars. So they're not really printing anything. All right. Third, the lending of money to banks. The Federal Reserve in the United States charges commercial banks interest on loans, which is called the discount rate. That's the federal rate that you hear in the news a lot. And the Fed charges interest to commercial banks to borrow money, and they do it all the time. Well, if the Federal Reserve makes it really easy for banks to get money, which is what the case is right now, then let's say it's like 0.5%. Well, banks are going to borrow money for 0.5%, turn around and sell it for a profit at, say, 1.5% or 2.5%. But if the Federal Reserve changes that discount rate and raises it up to, say, 1%, then obviously it's going to make the price of money that commercial banks charge its customers, which is people like you and me, more expensive. So if it goes up to 1%, then maybe they'll sell the money for 3% or 4%. Okay, so that's another function of the Federal Reserve Bank. The last one here is the controlling of the money supply is the fourth way, rather, in which the Federal Reserve can indeed control or manipulate, rather, the way in which the economy functions. Okay, so this would enable the Fed to influence interest rates, is what we mean by controlling the money. It's a little bit of an example. We'll get into that a little bit later. It's a little bit confusing, but we'll get into that later. And that enables the Fed to have the ability to change and control the money supply through interest rates by making money more or less scarce. Okay, well, I hope you found this video to be helpful. And here we go. We're launching our studies on monetary policy. We'll talk to you in a bit.